VPtv Newsreels with your host, Afsheen.
Hi, I'm Afsheen. You're watching VPtv Newsreels. Past week, we were visited by MPP MICHAEL COTEAU, and he spoke to students in the library. Here's VPtv reporter Hadier with that story.
Hi, I'm Hadier, and I'm Valley Park Student Council President. Today, Valley Park welcomed the Honorable MICHAEL COTEAU. He spoke with the grade 7s. Let's take a look.
So my name is MICHAEL COTEAU, and I grew up just around the corner. You know where Rochford is? Anyone live in Rochford? No one knows where Rochford is? You know where the Science Center is? You know the little brown building across the street? There's 10 St. Anne's and there's 7 Rochford. Do you live in Rochford? Do you know where it is? So I grew up, you know where it is? Okay, I grew up on 7 Rochford my whole life. So I came to Canada when I was about 4 years old. And we moved to Flemington Park here, and we moved into 7 Rochford. And I lived there until I left for university to go to Carleton University in Ottawa. Does anyone know where Carleton is?
We've never been to Ottawa.
Has anyone been to Ottawa? Okay, nice. So it was interesting, you know, the journey from, you know, coming here as an immigrant to going off to university to going into the workforce and then becoming a school board trustee and then an MPP. It's been a big journey for me. I'm 45 years old now, so I guess that's 41 years of, the story's not going to be that long, don't worry. I'll put it into 15 minutes. And then I'll talk a little bit about, since it's Black History Month, I'll talk a little bit about Black history in Ontario and Canada. And then I'll just open up for questions. Is that cool? Yes. Okay. What were your expectations today? What were you hoping to hear today? What were you hoping to hear? Social injustices. What were you hoping to hear? When your teacher said you're going to come in and sit down and a man's going to speak to you, what were you expecting to hear? Anything? Yeah? No? You're just stretching? How about you? Okay. Black History Month. So, you know what? I will start with my story, tell you a little bit about what happened, and then we'll talk a little bit about Black history. But my father's from a small little tiny island called Carriacou. I'm sure no one in the world has heard of it in this room, right? Am I right? Carriacou is so small, the island, is there a map in here? The library has to have a map. Andrew, can you use your super resources and find a map for us? So Andrew is really good at finding out the answers. Andrew works with me. His name's Andrew Green, and he grew up in the Don Mills community, works in my office. My father's from an island called Carriacou, and it's off the coast of Grenada. Does anyone know where Grenada is? Grenada. Not Grenada in Spain, Grenada in the Caribbean, yeah? Okay, so it's if Florida is here, okay, Florida kind of goes like this. Cuba, right? Yeah. Jamaica, yeah. South America, yeah. Go all the way to the end. Grenada is a little tiny dot at the end of the Caribbean, just above Venezuela. Look at this. See, I told you Andrew's amazing. So you see here, we're kind of like, so North America, we're here, of course. Go all the way to Florida, then go all the way out near the very, very end, and it's like right about there. I see it. Right there. See Venezuela? Yeah. So my father's from a little island off the coast of Grenada called Carriacou. 7,000 people. I was there a week ago. And it's a pretty incredible island. If you go into this, they have a small little tiny museum there in Carriacou. And it's interesting. If you actually look at the map of Carriacou, it shows you historically how it was set up. So it was set up, and I'll go into a little bit of the history, of Black history, but it was set up with slaves from Ghana when it was originally set up. It was a plantation. So everyone knows what happened during the slave trade, right? Yes. So they had this thing called the, I guess they called it the something triangle, the transatlantic triangle. Yeah, do you want to say something? Please put up your hand if you have anything to say at any time. Yeah?
I just have a question. What language do they speak?
So it was originally colonized by the French and then the Scottish, then the British, but they speak English. But if you stand in my father's island, Carriacou, you can see St. Vincent from your, so you can see a couple of different countries. That's how close they are. But what they would do is they would take people from Ghana, which is around here, so around this, so they would take them, or steal them, and take them to like the Caribbean. They would produce products. They would, collect products here and then take them back and sell them in Europe, and then they just go in a triangle like this. Boom, 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 boom. So interesting thing about the island is when you go to the island, there was a guy, do you know that, has anyone heard the word, and this is a little kind of, I hate talking about stuff like this, but you ever heard the word lynch? What is to lynch someone?
Sort of steal from them?
No. So back in the 1950s and 60s, actually from about 1880 in the United States until about 1960s, there were things where, the Ku Klux Klan? So white supremacist groups? So people who believe that, white people should be in control of everything and other people, back in the old days. So these guys would take black people and they would murder them. And they would do something called lynching. And I won't explain what that is, but the reason I bring up that name is because there was a guy back then in the 1800s, his name was Willie Lynch. And that's where the term comes from. He was a guy who set up slave plantations. Like, he was a guy who's like the mastermind behind what a plantation should look like. So it was interesting. If you go to my father's island, there was 7 plantations carved up on the island. And that's where they would steal people, bring them, and force them to work. And they would make sure that the people, the different groups were from different parts of Ghana. So maybe their languages were different, their culture was different. So they would normally get them to not like each other. Do you understand? So, there's an old saying, divide and conquer. So, if I want to control a bunch of people, what I would do is get them to all fight, and then I could, make a little bit of an alliance with them. But on the island, they had a different class system. So they had some blacks that were a little bit lighter skin, who would be like in the house or do administration. Then they would have people who were darker skin, who would actually do the plantation stuff and do the hard work. But the island is a perfect example of what the slave trade was all about. And if you go to the island, you can still see some of the leftover things from slavery, like a slave master's graveyard. You can see some of the places where the plantations were. So going there, it's very interesting. And it's a glimpse into what was happening in North America and the Caribbean. When the Europeans came here, they came here and almost 90% of the indigenous people died from what? From disease. From things like smallpox and things like that. A lot of them died. Then they took people from Africa, brought them here. And Canada, they actually had, slavery as well. Interesting, people don't know, but the guy, McGill University, it's named after a guy named McGill. He was a slave owner. So we have this history in Canada that we don't usually talk about, and people are starting to talk about it more. And it's important for us to pay attention, because some people say, well, what does black history have to do with me? But it's our history. It's the same as our indigenous history. It's the same as, the history of Polish people coming here in the 70s and 80s, or the Italians back at the turn of the century, the Irish who came, because of the potato famine in Ireland. This is all part of our history. And we all should share this history, because that history connects us with each other. When you have a next door neighbor who speaks a different language, and they walk by and you don't usually say hi to them, maybe they don't understand you, but then you learn how to say hello in their language, it changes the way you interact with them, correct? It's the same way about learning about someone else's history. It's important for us, I think, to understand, that, the Japanese, the Chinese were here 120 years ago in this country. The Chinese, were also exploited in building the railroad. We have to understand these stories, because it's part of, how we got here today. But I'll go back to my father's island. So it's a former slave colony called Carriacou. And they grew cotton and they grew sugarcane. What's sugarcane used to make?
Sugar.
Good man. It's also used to make rum. It's also used to make a few other products. But so my father's from that island. The island got its independence 44 years ago. You know, it's interesting. The Caribbean, they had their independence. You know, most of them in the 1960s. There was one island that had its independence before everyone else. In fact, it had its independence before even America. And the American generals, like Washington, learned from the generals in which country on how to start a revolution. Do you know? This is an interesting part of history that we don't often talk about in North America. It's Haiti. You know the country Haiti? So Haiti was the first place in North America to go through revolution. And the generals there, the commanders there, and they were Africans, you know, they actually taught the American generals how to conduct, you know, how to engage in warfare. So it's an interesting history that, again, we don't talk about. So my father's from that island, 18 years old. When you're a Canadian citizen, you also had a British citizen. Much like many of the other colonies, like India, New Zealand, you know, Jamaica. If you're part of the Commonwealth, you could travel freely throughout the Commonwealth as long as you had a passport. So my father went to England. He met my mother. My mother's white. She's blonde hair, green eyes. My father's black. So they met each other, and they had 2 children. They came to Canada. They had the 3rd kid, and my brother Stephen. And we grew up, again, in Flemington Park. The cool thing about Flemington Park is that it's very multicultural. You know, when I grew up in Flemington Park, there was so many different cultures that were there. And I recently went to, I was at there's an organization called the Economic Club of Canada. And it's where they talk about, you know, about money and finance and wealth and, you know, companies. And they invited me to come talk about racism. So I didn't know what to talk about. And I finally decided when I went in to talk to this economic club, so imagine a few hundred people, you know, these are all like, you know, CEOs and people who own companies, and I talked to them about why Canada needs to be more like young people from Flemington Park. That was my speech. And I talked about the fact that, you know, that we interact and we understand multiculturalism here, and the rest of the country has to understand it as well. Because if we don't, we can end up looking a little bit more like the United States, where there's a lot of trouble, right? You know, when it comes to racism and cultures getting along. So we came to Flemington Park. I grew up in the neighborhood and went to school at Grenoble. Anyone go to Grenoble? A couple people? Okay, so I went to Grenoble and from junior kindergarten to grade 6. And then after that, you had 2 choices. You could either come to Valley Park or Don Mills. I went to Don Mills. One of my brothers came here. So that's my story. When I was about 18 years old, I went off to university. I applied to get into university, which was a challenge for me because I wasn't very good academically. I got into university with not a very good mark, but I got in, like I just got in. And when I got to university, I had to teach myself how to study. I had to teach myself how to, because I wasn't very good at it. You know, I just kind of got by. But when I got to university, I started to get really good marks because the system there was a little bit easier for me. Who's planning to go to university? Okay, college? Who's going to do a trade? Anyone? Who's going to go right into the workforce? Okay, good. You are? You're going to go right, when you finish school, you're going right to work? You know, I'll tell you this. Let me pause and tell you this little thing about university and about college, about post-secondary education. You know, if you can go, which, you know, I think everyone has the opportunity to go to post-secondary, especially now because we've made tuition free in Ontario for those, you know, within a certain income bracket. But university or college is such an exciting place because it's where you get to find out who you are, and you know, you turn into an adult, you get to meet friends, you get independence, you get to make life decisions yourself. Don't waste that opportunity. Life is pretty long, and we know that if you graduate university, you will make about $2 million over the course of your life more than a person who just finishes high school. So keep that in mind. If you're not doing it because it's the right thing to do it for the money. Okay? So you also live a little bit longer, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff connected to that. But I went to university, and I started to get involved in politics. I went to the Flemington Park library, you know the resource center? Yeah. I went there to read what's the difference between political parties. I had no clue. Because growing up in my neighborhood, like no one ever talked about politics to me. Like no one. So I went to the library. We love the libraries, right? Libraries are great. Libraries are fantastic. I went to the library and I took out an encyclopedia. Does anyone know what an encyclopedia is? Yeah? Okay. It's like the old Google. I went and I opened up an encyclopedia and I read about the political parties here in Canada, and I read a little bit about what they represent and stand for, and I decided that, you know, I was of a particular party. I believed in it more. And I went into the Liberal Party headquarters and I asked if I could volunteer. And I started volunteering. I didn't know anyone in the building. I never met a Liberal before. I started volunteering. And this was just the summer before I went to university. Got to university, went into the headquarters there, volunteered, got involved, started volunteering for a guy named David Collinet, who was the member of parliament for this area back in the 1990s. And then after that, I started working for a guy named John Manley, who was the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. And then I finished school and went off to Asia. I worked in Korea for a few years. Has anyone been to Korea? Yeah, Korea is a pretty interesting country. South Korea. Yeah. So I almost got to North Korea. I almost went to North Korea, but they had these cruise ships, so you can go up to North Korea and go through the main capital. So this is 2000, 2001, 2002. But they said if I wanted to go, I had to give them my passport. I couldn't bring any camera. I couldn't use a watch. No technology. You have to surrender everything. And it kind of got a little nervous. So I was like, no. Yeah?
Oh yeah, I watched a video like in Korea, the president gives you, you're not supposed to go around.
Yeah.
Someone has to support you.
Someone has to be with you all the time, right? And there was a guy who took a sign off a wall. I don't know if you read this story, but a guy who took a sign off a wall in a hotel saying, you know, please don't, you know, loiter after 9 o'clock or something like that. And he was put in prison for that. So you're in a different country, different laws, right? So I went to Korea. I lived there for a couple of years, and I came back. And then in 2003, I decided I was going to run for school board trustee. Does anyone know what that job is? School board trustee? Yep.
School board trustee is sort of like, you're sort of in charge of the school, but it's like you're sort of representing certain schools in one area.
Right.
In certain things at the school board.
So you set the budget, like you figure out how the money is going to be spent. You set something called policy, which are like the rules, and you're responsible for the hiring of the director of education, and then the director of recommendation would make recommendations. So even your principal, for example, would go through the board of directors at the school board, or even teachers, any position goes through, so at the recommendation of the director of education. So there's it's a responsibility that allows the people, parents and citizens, to have control of the education system, just like we vote and have control of the government, right? You were going to say something. No? I don't know. You were going to say something? When I asked what a school board trustee was, do you remember?
I was going to say you're the trustee of the school.
Yeah, so do you know who your school board trustee is?
Nope.
Yeah, you've seen her before.
Yeah.
Think about it.
Yeah.
I don't know if your name, but Damon Visionary, you've seen her at concerts or graduation.
She's really good. She's pretty quiet. She sits in the back. She doesn't. Her first name is Jerry.
Okay.
Jerry Gershon.
Very good. Jerry Gershon. She's been your school board trustee probably from the 1980s, for a long time. Yeah. So she was a trustee. She always tells me a funny story when the school board was going to buy its first computer, and there was a debate about if they should purchase that computer. She tells me about that debate. It was a big deal. So there you go. That's how old. Don't tell her I said that though. So Jerry Gershon, she's incredible. She's very smart and really good at the school board. So I became a school board trustee. It was interesting because I went and knocked on 40,000 doors. I was 29 years old, knocked on doors. I asked people for their support, their vote, and they gave it to me, and I won. And that started off my political career. 8 years later, I ran for MPP, the local MPP, and everyone knows what an MPP is? What's an MPP? So, an MPP is a?
Member of provincial parliament.
You know why he knows the answer, right? You know why he knows the answer? Because he's what? VPtv. He's a reporter for VPtv, and you knew before that, right? But he came to Queen's Park, and they did an interview with me and some other members of provincial parliament. Oh, you see that? A member of provincial parliament. So I'm elected. So in 2011, I stood for election. I knocked on doors again, and I became a member of provincial parliament. And my job now is to make. I'm a lawmaker. So I sit with 107 people at Queen's Park, and we do debates. You know when you see those boring things on TV and people are standing up and talking about law? Well, that's what we do. And I do that at the legislature, and we make law, and we also set the budget and the expenditure for the taxes. Do you know how much money we collect in taxes a year in Ontario? How much?
A lot. 10 million.
Okay, you know what's interesting about 10 million? So this, how many people, 50 people here? 60? Just in this room right here, you represent $700,000 in taxes. About $13,000 a student. So think about it from that, and then think about it, you're two classes. So this school probably generates about $15 million in tax revenue to keep this school going. Just the school alone.
And there's other schools.
And there's 5,000 more schools in Ontario. The Toronto District School Board's expenditure is about $2.4 billion. The Ontario government's about $130 billion. Do you know how much money that is? I want you to envision this. Imagine a suitcase of $1 million. A lot of money, right? Now, put that down on the ground and put 1,000 on top of it, right? And then create 130 piles like that. That's how much money it is. We spend every single year in taxes in Ontario. So I won the election, became part of Kathleen Wynne, your MPP's government. I was the minister responsible for citizenship and immigration. Also did tourism, culture, sport. You know the Pan Am Games?
Yeah.
I was responsible for the Pan Am Games, and now I'm responsible for Children Youth Services and fighting racism. So last night I was at a town hall meeting on racism, and a lot of people came out. It was a bit wild. But that's what I do. I look for ways to fight systemic racism, so to make sure that everyone has equal opportunity regardless of their color, skin, their religion, and their beliefs. So that's what I do. That's who I am. I have two daughters, married, and I have one daughter who's almost 12 and one daughter who just turned 8. So that's pretty much my life story. Any questions? Yep. Well, we have 107 people and they have to vote on it. I can't make a crazy law because number one, like if I made a law saying that there's no more homework, number one, the legislature wouldn't vote in favor of it. And number two, your parents wouldn't vote for me anymore. They would say that guy is not thinking right.
Well, you should have to do it now.
But you can't vote. Maybe if you guys could vote, maybe I'd consider doing it, but I'm only kidding. But yeah, we make laws. So like, a recent law that, and I always talk about this one the last several years that we did, you can't smoke a cigarette in a car when a kid's in the car. Right? Things like that. Or what's another recent law?
Weed. Wait, I put it very
Cannabis. So who said weed?
Me.
Yeah, okay. So that's legalization. That's a federal law under the criminal code. So they decriminalized marijuana as of June of this year. Yep.
Did you ever make a law you broke to it?
Did I break a law?
No, you made one and then you broke it by accident.
Did I broke it by accident?
No, you make a law, then you broke it. Like you made the law and then you break it on your own.
No, I can't think of any. No. There's been, in the last couple of years, we've changed some things. So, for example, when the police could just stop anyone and ask for their information, they called it carding. Hey, you're walking down the street minding your business, and the cop stops you and says, I want to see your ID. That actually would happen when we were growing up in Fleming Park, like right across the street where there used to be a 7-Eleven. Is it still 7-Eleven?
No INS, no.
Yeah.
Rest in peace.
Yeah, so like there was a police officer there that would just constantly come and like, it's lunchtime and get everyone, look at people's ID, things like everyone would complain about that. But you can't do that now in Ontario. So, there's things that change all the time. Yep, I know it's Bill C-51? Yeah. So I think that there was some pieces that were in that weren't very fair to citizens in general. So, we always have to remember that, when I say we, I mean the people are the ones that put the people in place to run our government. It's not, their government or my government, it's your government. So you always have to keep that in mind. When young people come to Queen's Park, I always ask them, whose building are you in? And it usually takes about 10 to 15 answers before someone says, this is my building, it's our building. And you have to keep that in mind. The government is not something that's separate from you, the government is yours. And when you see things that happen in government, it's important for you to talk about it to your teacher, invite guests to challenge them, to write letters, things like that. But you need to pay attention, you need to be active. So that's, pretty much my life, how I got to this point. It's interesting, as I was driving here today, I remember there was so I did one semester, I did summer school and one semester at Marc Garneau. And I remember when I was there was a judge named Judge Grisel, who's the first black high court judge in Ontario. And I remember he came in to do exactly what I'm doing here today. And I could remember, and it was, I think, during Black History Month, and it was interesting because he said, and I could remember him so clearly saying, and it reminded me, he says, sometimes you have to learn twice as much, you have to run twice as fast. And he also said, and I remember this driving here today, he said you have to learn, so you can earn. And I never forgot that when he said that. It's kind of back to what I was saying about the importance of post-secondary education. So now we've changed the laws, so, the rules, sorry. If your family makes less than 52 or 50?
For tuition?
Yeah.
50.
If your family makes less than 50,000, your tuition is paid for by government, by the people of Ontario. If your family makes more than 50,000, it starts to scale up, meaning that you may get 80% if you have 60,000. If you have 70,000, maybe 70%. So tuition and the cost of post-secondary should never stop a young person from going to school. Like the cost should never affect your ability to go to school. Keep that in mind, and that's what we've put in place. Yes, sir.
I want you to take yourself back to 12 or 13 years old. How old is everybody? 12, 13?
Yeah.
And some of what I see in my job are lots and lots of kids making really good choices that open doors, and other kids developing habits now that I know are sort of closing doors. So I want you to take yourself back to when you were 12 or 13.
Right.
What did you see? What advice would you give with regards to how to manage middle school or how to manage the next few years? Because one thing I've noticed, ladies and gentlemen, is that by the time kids get to grade 11 and grade 12, they kind of know where they're going. But honestly, a lot of grade 7 students don't quite know where they're going, but these are still really important years to make sure you get lots of options ahead of you. So my question to you is, if you could go back when you were 12 and 13 years old, what were some of the things that helped you keep in the front of your mind so that you would have all these opportunities that you had?
Being 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, it's a challenging time. And I remember myself being very confused, about a lot of things. So maybe I'll rephrase the question in this way. If I could go back in time, take myself right now, and sit down with my 13, 14, 15-year-old self, and I could provide some advice to myself, I would say this, that when you're young, there's a lot of opportunity. A lot of opportunity. People will open doors for you. People will just want to help you just because you're young. Take advantage of the fact that you can learn a lot, at this age, because people will be friendly and they'll open doors for you. So what I mean by that is, if you wanted to volunteer somewhere, if you want to learn something new. I had a friend And he was 16 years old. I worked in John Manley's office, so I was about 21. He was a summer student. He was about 16. He phoned, and this is no word of a lie. His name was James Hill. I saw him yesterday. He phoned one of the richest guys in Canada and asked if he could have an appointment with him. And he lived in Ottawa. And he picked up the phone, and the secretary who answered laughed at him. It's like, who are you? What do you mean you want an appointment? Like, he said, well, and he explained who he was. He said, I'm a 15, 16-year-old young person in Ottawa. I'm a big admirer, this and this, blah, 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 and phoned a couple of times, and they gave him the appointment. He jumped on the train, went to Toronto by himself, and sat down with one of the richest guys. I think it was Peter. Is it Peter Monk? Who owns Barrick Gold?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So I think it was that. But imagine that. Imagine that window being open. Do you think that if I called the richest guy in Canada and said, hi, my name's Michael, I'm a 45-year-old man, I want to come see the richest man. Why? Well, just because I want to talk to him. Do you think that they would let me come and see that person? No. Do you think if a 14, 15-year-old young person makes that call, people want to help young people. So don't be afraid to learn from people, to ask for help, and to look for opportunities because you're young. And it's the best time to learn, so why not take advantage of that goodness that people have to offer? Does that seem reasonable? The other thing is, the decisions you make today will position you for the rest of your life. So the decisions you make over the next 3, 4, 5 years will affect your entire life. Remember when I said, if you finish post-secondary, the more education you get, the more money you're going to bring in. Imagine the difference between a high school graduate going into the workforce, a university graduate, $2 million difference over the course of their life. Can you imagine what the difference is, and when you have your master's, PhD level, or you're in a profession that you actually enjoy going to work, what it does to you? The more education you have, and this is absolutely scientifically proven, the more education you have, the longer you live. So you take, and there was a piece in the Boston Herald, and they took these black males and they took white males, and they looked at their life expectancy. And because of income level, the life expectancy level of the black males were shorter than the white males. But when you took the black males and you actually looked at them from those who have their master's, PhD, they went above the average white life expectancy. So the more education you get, the better you're going to be positioned in life. So my advice to you is to get the best education you can possibly get. Sometimes, doing your master's is not for you, and that's fine. Sometimes, going out and, doing a trade or, that might be more aligned to your skill sets. But my point is this, is that education is not something that stops. It's a lifelong journey. You have to keep building education as part of who you are and grow. And the more educated you become, it doesn't mean you have to have a certificate. It means just educate yourself, and the better you are positioned for life. Any other questions? No? Okay, how much more time do we have?
As much time as you want.
Yeah?
I know there's an Apple thing happening as well when you're,
Okay,
when you're done.
so we're about 10, about 5 minutes? Okay, so I haven't talked about Black History Month. I just want to take a couple minutes to talk about Black History Month. Again, Black History Month is not just for black people. It's for everyone, because it's part of our culture. Just like learning about immigration patterns and what's happened to many different cultures in this country is all part of who we are as Canadians. So, when do you think the first black person came to Canada? Does anyone know? 17 something? 18? Yeah. I think the exact date was 1603. Matthew da Costa. He was a black African who worked with Champlain. Samuel Champlain, yeah. He was an interpreter with what's the indigenous group out in Newfoundland? Micmac? So he was an interpreter on that ship. 1603? 1605? 1603. So he was the first recorded black person that arrived here. So black people have been part of the Canadian or the North American experience for 400 years. It's interesting, when you go out to places like Nova Scotia, places in Quebec, even in Ontario, you can see the history of early settlement in black communities. I want to talk a little bit about the experience in Nova Scotia, because they had a few different waves of black immigration. They had the Loyalists, the War of Independence in America.
Yeah.
A lot of them came up through that. Then there was a wave through the Underground Railroad. In Nova Scotia, they had the Maroons, who were from Jamaica, who protested against the government and were expelled out of Jamaica and brought up to Nova Scotia. But there's a long history. But black people have fought in every war to defend this country or this colony. They've been part of society since the beginning, but they've always been kind of in the background. There's some pretty interesting people out there. And I'm going to tell you about one person in particular. His name is William Hubbard. Does anyone know that name? He was a city councillor in Toronto back in 1880s. He was the first black elected city councillor in Canada. And his story is pretty interesting because it starts off right behind here in the Don River. You know the Don River? So he's this young guy. He's in the Don River, and there's a guy named George Brown. Does anyone know who George Brown is? George Brown is one of the fathers of Confederation. He's the guy who started the Globe paper. You know the Globe and Mail? He's a father of Confederation, and he was an abolitionist, meaning that he fought against slavery, what was taking place in the United States. So he's an abolitionist. So George Brown is in the back going along the Don River. This Don River right here, right there. And he is with his horse carriage, and he falls into the river. And this sounds like a made-up story, but it's a real story. And a young guy named William Hubbard jumps into the river and apparently saves his life. So George Brown takes him under his wing and says, you know what, I'm going to help you. Helps him build up a bit. And this guy runs for city councilor. He wins. And as a city councilor, he's the guy who starts Toronto Hydro. He's the first person to start Toronto Hydro. He also is fighting for immigrants' rights in Parkdale, so helping the Chinese immigrants and fighting for their rights. He took that on as a big cause of his. But William Hubbard became the first he was the acting mayor when the mayor was ill. So he was the first black mayor, but he was acting mayor, but the first only black mayor of Toronto, and that was 120 years ago. So William Hubbard is a pretty interesting guy. If you go down to, near the, an area, the old Don Jail, there's a big park there. They just named that park after him last year. And they have an award in Toronto called the William Hubbard Award. So it's pretty interesting. We have these great little stories that are in our community that speak to the history of black people in this country. But again, the stories that are out there are not just for people of African descent, they're for all of us because it builds our identity as Canadians. And the more diversity we have in these stories that reflect who we are today, if you're from Pakistan, you're from India, you're from Jamaica, you're from any part of Africa, from Europe, these are the stories that make up who we are as Canadians. So they're pretty cool stories, and we need to learn them and share them because it makes us understand each other a bit more. So any other questions? No?
After Valley Park, I'd like to give you one of our We Are Valley Park
Wow.
sweatshirts for you to wear around the community.
That's awesome.
There you go.
We're here with Michael Coteau. Michael Coteau, such a great speech you have out there. Would you like to leave any final thoughts?
I just want to say Valley Park's an incredible school. Make sure that, if you're online, you subscribe to VPtv. It's where the news is at.
VPtv Newsreels with your host, Afsheen.
Thank you, Hadier, for that report. We'll see you again next time. I'm Afsheen, and you're watching VPtv.